welcome. We're super glad to have all of you here for a workshop on Quarto. As preliminary introductions, my name is Renata Diaz. I'm a data scientist with the data science team in the Communications and Cyber Technology unit. I'll talk a little bit more in a second about what our group does and what we do, but spoiler, a big part of what we do is offer these workshops, so we're excited to have you here. As a quick overview of the plan for today, here's a rough timetable. We're already a little bit behind, but I'm sure we'll catch up. This is going to be a workshop about sharing research reports that you've created using R or RMarkdown using Quarto. And so we're going to start by talking about what Quarto is and what its capabilities are. And then I'll work through some examples of generating Quarto reports starting from scripts that you may have in R or an RMarkdown file, and go over some ways of sharing these example Quarto reports. And then the plan is to take a short break and then to spend a good amount of time with the opportunity for you to work from a script that you may already have written, either as an R script or an RMarkdown script, and converting that into a Quarto document, and then working through ways of sharing that report, like on online publishing platforms or portable documents that you can pass around. And then at the end, connect you to additional resources to get more help after this workshop.
Renata, before you go on, could you make me a co-host on Zoom?
Oh, yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. You should be a co-host now, Eric. Thanks. So, welcome. We're glad you're all here. I have one question for the room, and especially for the folks who are here right now. At the beginning, before the workshop, we sent around a quick poll just asking you about your level of familiarity with things like R Markdown, or Quarto. So could we maybe get, because we're curious and because it will help us sort of like with the rest of the workshop, could you give us a thumbs up or a green check mark if you've used RMarkdown or if you feel comfortable working with RMarkdown? Awesome. Okay, cool. Because Quarto is a very close sibling taxon to RMarkdown, so it's good to have a sense of how much overlap we've got. Yes, and those of you who were in the fall reproducibility series, some of this will be familiar, and we're glad to see you back. Before we go further, I like to say a little bit about what our unit is and what we do. I think everyone here, we know you, we've talked to you, but for a refresher, we're a unit whose mission is to support reproducible research practices, data analysis pipelines, and software development throughout ALSCII. So we do that through offering workshops. We have drop-in hours, Tuesday mornings at 9 on GatherTown. We run an incubator program where we'll collaborate with you on a short-term project, doing something computational that then we'll hand off to you, or we're available for longer-term collaborations. And to learn more about everything we do and to get more involved in that, here's the link to our website. More logistics for this workshop. All of the slides that I'm going to show today are available at this link, and I'll share that in the chat. And these slides also link out to the different documents that we'll be looking at today, so those resources are all available to you. To work through the examples we're going to be using with Quarto and RStudio, we recommend having a recent version of RStudio and Quarto installed. You can check which version of RStudio you have, and you can check if Quarto is installed following these instructions. Also, I believe that recent versions of RStudio come with Quarto bundled, so it may already be taken care of for you. Can I get, just to check where we're at in the room, could you give me a thumbs up or green check mark or generally positive reaction if you have Quarto set up on your machine already? Awesome. I'm a fan of the confetti. I guess it's the ta-da emoji. It's one of my favorites. Um, so our hopes for you as we finish up this workshop is that you'll walk away with an understanding of what Quarto is. We've talked about it a bunch. We'll actually get into it, what it can do, and how it differs from programming languages like R or other markup languages like Markdown or RMarkdown. You'll have worked through the process of generating your own Quarto report, documenting your research, and you'll have had the opportunity to share that report using one of these modalities, depending on what's applicable to you. And that you will have a sense of where you can go to get additional help or do more things with Quarto than we're going to be able to cover in this workshop, because we are focusing on just a small slice of the kinds of things you can do with this system. Great. So talked a lot about Quarto as this idea of what is it. This is taken straight from the website for Quarto that is a quote-unquote open source scientific publishing system, which is kind of a mouthful, but that's exactly what it is. It's a publishing system in that it's a way for you to integrate code, the results of that code, formatted text, and a lot of other things like reference tracking, like citations, tables. You can even create like interactive HTML widgets in Quarto. We won't cover that today, but you can enfold all of these things into a single document. Those document types can range from a static HTML page. You can make a slideshow. So I actually made these slides using Quarto, or interactive dashboards. And they all come from a single source file that you generate. So it's sort of high leverage means of generating all these different document types within a consistent working environment. And the Quarto software is published and generated by a company called Posit, which is formerly RStudio. They're a company, but it is a completely free and open source platform to use. And the nice thing about it is that there's good reason to believe it will continue to be supported out into the future. And so at a high level, the way Quarto works, especially if you're an R user, is going to be reminiscent of RMarkdown. We'll have what's called a source document that can contain all kinds of things. You can have code, text, captions, references, hyperlinks, and then Quarto can render, and there's a whole bunch of magic that happens in the rendering step that we will hopefully not need to explain for the end user, that generates formatted documents of different types. And these are some of the most common ones that I like to use: HTML, Word documents, Markdown files, or PDFs. And then those you can distribute in a whole bunch of different ways. And those can find new life as supplements to manuscripts or websites or things that you share between yourself and collaborators. And so for an example of what it is I'm talking about, because I do think this is something that maybe makes the most sense when you get a look at it. Here is an example of a research report that I generated using Quarto. This is very similar to what we might be generating later today. So this is an HTML document that is derived from one of the supplements to a paper I wrote a couple of years ago. And I will say I generated the actual published supplement for this paper in RMarkdown, and the outputs of those RMarkdown files are what's in the journal archive. So you can generate publishable scholarly materials using this framework. And so this is the end result of a Quarto document that looks like magic, at least to me. So a few of the features that I want to point out here are that we have scholarly references are fully tracked. I didn't have to do anything particularly involved. I can show you what the process is for generating this, where there's a link from where the references appear in the text. You can click on this and it'll take you down to a references section, and it'll also link you out to the associated DOIs. You can have also tracking of things like the authors. So you can link your ORCID ID and it will show up here in the author byline. You could have multiple authors with ORCID IDs attached. Within the text of the document, we have things like headings broken out with like high-level headings and subheadings. And you can have things like emphasis and offsetting things that are like labeled as R code in line with the formatting. And we can interweave actual evaluated code. So this is a supplement that goes over a data analysis pipeline where we take in the data, analyze the data, and generate the results. And we can include and annotate the code for doing this. Here it's hidden behind these little drop downs, but if I click on this, we'll have the code appear and it'll walk us through each of the steps to reproduce this analysis. So here's a chunk for installing this boutique R package that is involved in this analysis. Here's code for downloading the data. And as we work through the analysis, we have this code interwoven with text annotating what's going on in the code. And if we continue on down, we're working through the stages of an analysis until we get to results. And so these results are the results of the code that was, the outputs of the code that were computed previously. We can format output of, this is an output of a data frame in R that's been formatted as a table. And we can output figures. So there's this figure is being generated by the code that's evaluated as part of this document as well. And there's more. These figures, so you may notice there's figure 1 is named here. It has a caption. This is something that I've included in the source code for this document as well. And this figure is linked in the text. If we scroll up, we could find a reference to figure 1. This is clickable and will take us down to where figure 1 is located in the text. So this is a beautiful document that is hopefully for a collaborator highly readable, highly digestible. And to be honest, I would have no idea how to generate this without using something like Quarto. Or I would, but it would take me hours and hours in Microsoft Word. So this is the output of the Quarto document. How do we generate this? And this is where we come to the idea of the source code. You can look at the source code on GitHub here. If you want to follow the link, it will show up in this text. I can also hop over to show it to you in my R, which I think is a little bit easier to look at than the GitHub formatted version. What questions do folks have right now while I change the screen share? Yes, the automated links to figures is one of my favorite things. Christina mentioned in the chat.
Yeah, looking at this, you may be getting into this later, but I'm just curious about the differences between Quarto and RMarkdown because it looks very similar to me just through going through this. And I think there are some features that you mentioned that I'm not sure RMarkdown does, but I'd be interested in hearing kind of that comparison, whether it's now or if you are getting into it later.
Yeah, I think that's we have some content on that later. And the short version is a lot of, I would say almost, well, I think the Venn diagram of our markdown functionality within Quarto functionality is like concentric circles. I'm not, that may not be quite true for like little nooks and crannies of like esoteric R markdown things, but Quarto does R markdown things and has additional features that branch out. Yeah, so I guess here's a look at the source code for the document I just showed you. And at a first level, it looks nothing like that beautiful HTML document I showed you. But it does have slots where we modify things to make it show up in that HTML document. And so if you're familiar with R Markdown, this is very similar. We have a .qmd document that we can open in RStudio. And then we have code chunks, for example, here, that are flagged with, here they're flagged as R. They contain code, the code gets evaluated. Outside of the code chunks, we have text written in flavors of Markdown. And we have a header at the very top of the document that specifies the title of the document, and then some document-wide options that we'll get more into. Some of the features that I was waxing poetical about, we have text formatting using Markdown syntax for like underscores for italics. We have reference tracking with this like @ mention symbol. And we have tracking of that figure tracking where you can click on figure 1, it shows up as tracked again using that @ symbol. We have all of this code. Some of this code is getting run without showing up in the document, and some of it is getting run and getting printed to the document, but we're conducting the whole analysis in these code chunks and then printing out the results in these special code chunks that we have labeled. And we have a little references section at the bottom, which is super useful for that reference tracking that I mentioned earlier. How are folks doing with this? Given that I think most of us have some familiarity with R Markdown, does this look familiar? Is anyone sort of having questions about the high-level idea if we have a source document and we have the output, and there's some alchemy happening under the hood that's going from this basically plain text appearing document into the HTML output? So getting to this question of, okay, what about R Markdown? Because as we see that document, oh, sorry. Oh, I skipped a slide. Before we get into R Markdown, I'm going to sell you a little bit more on why would we do this. The number one reason for me, at least, is reproducibility. And that comes to this idea of dynamic updating, which again carries directly over from R Markdown, but is that if I change something in my analysis or I get a new data file with Quarto, I don't need to regenerate every figure, copy paste it into a Word document, update the formatting and hope I didn't send everything into another continent, and like repeat that process every time something changes in my data. The formatting, all of that will get baked into that report the next time I render it and the next time I generate it, which is hugely protective against copy paste errors, against like, you know, when you have to like change the headers in a table every time you copy paste it, something's going to get lost, something's going to get confused. It's protective against that, and it makes it much more efficient to generate these kinds of highly communicable reports. And they are extremely easy to share around. It's much easier, or it can be much easier to collaborate using a Quarto report because it's easier to track changes, I find, than some of the other platforms we have available. And the outputs can be rendered to a bunch of different formats depending on your audience and shared pretty much directly. I think, like I mentioned, I was like, these manuscript appendices, I just rendered them and those outputs go to the journal. So you can have something that has very few stages between what you're generating and what you can share widely. Yeah, so what about RMarkdown? Quarto is in a lot of ways like the successor to RMarkdown. I don't believe RMarkdown is like expected to go away anytime soon, but I also think that most of the new exciting features are coming via Quarto. For the most part, an RMarkdown document will translate seamlessly over into Quarto. A lot of times you don't need to change anything to get it to render using Quarto. However, Quarto has some expanded functionality beyond what's possible in RMarkdown. And this is not going to be an exhaustive list of those things, but some of the ones that I think are particularly salient are Quarto supports languages outside of R. Quarto is actually not at all an R specific platform. You'll see it for Jupyter. It's can be used with R, but it's much more language agnostic, and it's much easier in Quarto than in RMarkdown to integrate different languages. So, for example, it's technically possible to execute Python code and R code in an RMarkdown document, but you have to do a fair bit of gymnastics, and Quarto abstracts away a lot of the gymnastics there. And Quarto has a expanded range of document types, and here I'm not just talking about like generating to a Word document or generating to a PDF document. Quarto, again, is, I think you can make slides in RMarkdown, but Quarto is good for slides. It's good for books, websites, interactive dashboards, shiny dashboards. They're adding a document type for a scientific manuscript. There are blogs. So for these like more advanced or like more adventurous applications of this sort of literate programming workflow, Quarto has a lot more options. And again, it's kind of the leading edge of development in a way that the new things like are likely to come in via Quarto. And so here is a rough comparison that I made for folks who are coming from familiarity with either just Markdown or RMarkdown or Quarto. Again, so I wouldn't necessarily say that some of these things are technically possible, but they're much harder depending. So all of these share having this sort of markup syntax, rendering to different types of documents, and the capacity to have like code formatted text mix in with text formatted text. It's Quarto and RMarkdown, not so much Markdown, that's going to allow you to execute code and print out those results. And again, these are just highlights. For Quarto, you have the additional functionality of executing non-R code easily, and a much wider set of documents than are available for RMarkdown. Cool. So what questions do we have right now before we can move on to an example of translating an R script into a Quarto document?
I was curious about if RMarkdown, if there's a plan for like deprecating it in favor of Quarto, and it looks like that they're planning on supporting RMarkdown for at least for the foreseeable future. So
That is something I really appreciated about like the Quarto rollout, is that they've made it really easy for our Markdown users to not have to change if you don't want to change, which I have a lot of respect for, given it's like the opposite of the way USB cables work, where you have no choice but to change every 3 years. So yeah, if you want to keep your RMarkdown documents in RMarkdown, you can. But some of the shiny new fun stuff is, no pun intended on shiny, some of the shiny new fun stuff is probably coming in through Quarto. Yeah. Okay. So I thought it would be fun and illustrative to work through an example of the situation where you have an R script that you want to do up as a Quarto report. And I also have an example of using an R Markdown and converting that one over. So we can start with working through an R script that we can convert to a Quarto report. And I'm going to work through this example. You're welcome to follow along with me or just watch. And then after, at the second half of the workshop, there'll be more time to work through a script of your own if you'd like. So you should be able to get this script from this URL if you would like it. I'll pop it in the chat as well. And if you follow this URL, get a new tab. If you follow this URL, you're going to want to download this script by clicking on the download raw file and save it to your computer. You could also view, I'll show again, you can also view this file by clicking on this place that says raw and then copy paste it. And then copy paste it into an R script, if that's simpler than finding wherever your downloads folder puts it. And I will hop over to my RStudio and show you the script on my computer. And I bet this needs to be much bigger to be informative. How is that for a text size for folks?
Looks good.
Thanks. Yeah. So this is an R script that I mocked up. We can talk through what it does very briefly. It's gonna download a couple of data files and store them wherever your current working directory is. And then we're going to pull in some data. It's mouse data. So this is, for anyone who's familiar, these are data from a long-running research project called the Portal Project that fieldwork happens in Arizona, just 3 hours southeast of Tucson. It's where I did a lot of work for my PhD, and it's also just really fun data because it's all about mice. And so this script is going to open these data and generate a plot of how abundant the mice are. And so I'm just running this code to show how this looks, how the plot that we're going to generate. I need to regenerate it so it shows up in the RStudio window. It's reluctant to show up for some reason. Oh, there it is. It's just slow. So we have a whole bunch of species of mouse, and it's going to show us how abundant they are at different points in time. And we'll generate a table of the most abundant mice that ever were. So I'm not spending too much time on the details of this code, except to say that we're importing some data and then we're going to make a plot, and then we're going to get a table that shows us the most abundant species of mice at this site that we've ever seen. And so we have this Hippopotamus merriami, who's we've seen 12,000 of over about 40 years of censusing. So this is an R script, and say we'd like to generate these outputs so that we don't have to wait for the RStudio plots pane to refresh every time we want to look at them. And that's what we'll do with Quarto. So I like to work through a series of kind of prescriptive steps when I'm converting a script to a Quarto document. And the first step is to create an empty Quarto document to pull the code over into. So in RStudio, you go to File, New File, and a Quarto document. And it'll think.
Definitely taking its time.
Yeah, my RStudio is seeming to be like pretty laggy, to be honest. There we go. And here we can give it a title. I think I decided this is called the mouse report. And we can say the author is me. And there's some additional options here that we can go ahead and leave as they are. Especially this visual markdown editor option can make things a lot easier. And create. So here, Quarto has given us an empty document with some boilerplate in here. Can go ahead and get rid of all of this. And what I like to do next is move over my code chunks. And to be honest, what I typically do is take everything as one big chunk. You could also bring over sections one at a time. So for example, we could say first step is to download the files. Here I'm writing some text that will say step one is to download the files. And create now my first code chunk to get set up. And our so this may look different from how it often looks in RMarkdown because it's defaulted to using this visual editor. But if we say R, it'll give us a code chunk, and the rest of the time it'll be showing us whatever we typed in, formatted as it will be more or less in the final document. So let's copy that code over. Let's pull over our libraries. And pull over this code to download files. And similar to RMarkdown, we have this little run current chunk button, which I will go ahead and restart my R so that I get a clean environment, and you can see it as it runs. And so similar to RMarkdown, we've managed to run the chunk and we get the output below it. Can keep copying things over. Let's see, what's the next section of that script? Is probably loading the data. Again, it's these 3 hashes to create a code chunk. This is equivalent to RMarkdown. And we'll show up with a little code chunk. Loading the data. What's next? Wrangle the data. More code chunk.
Eric mentioned a couple of the other ways to make a new code chunk in the chat.
Oh, sweet. Yeah.
Too. There's like many ways to do it.
There are many ways to do it. And yeah, the way I'm doing it is probably, oh, there's no wrangling. There's just plotting. Let's plot the data. I can show some of these other ways. The way I'm doing it is probably betrays my history as an RMarkdown user for many years. Is that it's baked into my fingertips to give us the 3 little backticks. But yeah, so we could create a chunk using this insert in this visual editor. And sorry, my screen share is blocking my controls there, but can insert an executable R cell by going here. And let's go ahead and put our next chunk of code in there. And so just annotate this with show. What's going on there? Anyway, show the abundances. And let's go ahead and render this as it is and see what we get. We've copied over our code chunks with a little bit of rudimentary descriptive text. And for our Markdown users, it's no longer knit, it's shifted over to render. And similar to our Markdown, it will want you to save it before you render it. So we can call it the mouse report. It'll think through the rendering process. And we will get a preview of our document over here in the viewing pane. You can also, there's this little button that'll show it in a new window. I'm not going to click on that because I'm not sharing my Firefox right now. It'll just be more clicking, but you could do that and it would open up in your web browser. And so here we have a preview of this report as it would show up in a Quarto document. It's got the title and we have our code. And we're getting the outputs of our code as a plot. And we've got this table. So all of this is very similar to our Markdown. You know, it's a good report. We could make it prettier though, and we could do a whole bunch to make it look a lot more like the original example that I'd shown you. So one of the, I think, most important things to be able to do in these reports for scientists is getting tables to format in a way that's pleasing to look at. And you can do this in lots of different table formatting methods. In Quarto, I'm fond of using this function called knitr cable to reformat these table outputs so that instead of the raw data frame output, we can see what that looks like by running render. And so with that, we see the table has gone from looking like raw R code output to looking like a nicely formatted table. Some of the updates between Quarto and RMarkdown that are really useful to show and can be really powerful for this kind of work is the capacity to modify the chunks, and especially that table and figure tracking that we saw in the example document. So for example, we're showing a figure and we can add figure references to this figure. I'm going to show you where that figure shows up in the document right now by modifying the code chunk options for the chunk that figure occurs in. This is going to be similar to how it may work in RMarkdown, but the way we specify the options is changed. So you may be familiar with specifying options in RMarkdown as like R, comma, like figdim equals like whatever you're going to make the figure dimensions. Here we're going to use the heard it called a hash pipe. It is a hashtag followed by that vertical pipe. And these things need to follow directly after the point at which the line at which you specify like that it's R. And let's go ahead and if we use this argument label, that's similar to the way in RMarkdown you can like name your code chunk as like R like download data or something. And if we say label and then specify fig hyphen something else, we're going to tell Quarto that this chunk is going to output from something that I want you to treat as a figure. So let's call it like fig abundances. And we can specify a figure caption if we use this argument fig hyphen cap. We can put some text like abundances of different species over time. And first, let's just see what happens if we render this. Oh, bad indentation. Oh, I didn't like that
Doesn't like
period.
the period, yeah.
Yeah. So over here in the output, we see we've now gotten a caption associated with this figure. And it's taken care of, notice that it says, so we have a caption that's specifying this figure. Notice also that we never told it this was figure 1. It just knew this is the first figure that has showed up in this document and numbered it accordingly. So if you were to add subsequent figures, you wouldn't need to keep track of like figure numbering, which is accounted for, I don't know how many hours of my life as a graduate student. It counts the figures for you. And the really nice thing about this is then in the text portion of this document, we can refer to this figure and link to it without having to do a whole bunch of hyperlinking hijinks. So for an example of that is I'm going to go over here to my source editor. I'm trying to make it big so you can see it. And let's say, look at figure 1. Or like look at the Look at the mouse abundances. If I could spell abundances. And then we can refer to the figure, for example, at fig-abundances. And let's see what that does. They said to look at the mouse abundances, and over here in the output, we get a link to figure 1. So for perhaps decorum's sake, we could put that in parentheses. But it's using that at sort of mention syntax for the social media savvy among us, I guess, the at syntax there to link to figures. And you can do the same thing with tables. So this is a chunk that puts out tables, yeah?
I was going to say there's Ujjal is having difficulty with figure captions. So maybe before we go on to tables, is that still not working for you, Ujjal?
Yeah, no, it's not showing up in the document.
Uh-huh. Are you
Yeah,
able to share your screen to get a look at it?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll let you have the screen share.
Is it visible?
Yeah, okay, so
So,
try deleting that empty line you have in line 35.
mhm.
Yeah, and now try rendering it.
Oh, now
There we go.
So we
Yeah,
can
so all
Yeah.
the chunk options have to go right immediately underneath that
okay.
the 3
in-
backticks. But yeah,
So in none
nice.
of the code, we cannot have any like space or like empty lines in between the code, or like we
Specifically
have
between the like chunk header and the options, you could have white space between lines 36 and 37, and that would be fine. It's just the like options arguments there need to be right after the curly braces.
Okay, thanks.
Is
Yeah,
that
no,
the
it's
only,
tricky.
is that the only part of the Quarto documents that are sensitive to line spacing like that?
The
Or empty
YAML headers
lines?
can't be.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think otherwise. Oh, and like breaking up paragraphs, the same as in Markdown or RMarkdown. It'll be sensitive to how many lines of space there are between paragraphs, or it needs at least 2 lines to create a new paragraph. You need to have a line between the header of a bulleted list and the bullets and stuff, but otherwise, it's pretty resilient to those things.
Yeah. I've definitely screwed up the like forgetting to put a line at the top of like a list, and
Oh
it
yeah.
shows up all in a row or whatever.
Oh yeah. Or a line before a new header gets me a lot. Yeah. So the same logic applies for tables. So this chunk, coming back to the text, this chunk prints out a table, and we could provide information about the table and tag it as a table using that same label syntax. So it's that hashtag pipe, and here we say label, and if we preface it with TBL hyphen, it'll know it's a table. So we could say table abundances, for example. And we can have table captions the same way we have a figure caption with TBL hyphen cap. And we could say like the most abundant mice of all. And so rendering that. Here we have over in the output document, our table now has a table label and a caption that match what we provided. And we could similarly tag the table in the text by saying like D Mary MI is highly abundant. And it's that at table abundances. We update. Why didn't that work?
I don't know if you planned this, Renata, but this was something I was going to bring up. This is great. If you switch back to the visual, or if you switch to the source editor, you'll see what went wrong. And
so
this is a good opportunity, I think, to show people what happens in the source when you change some of the visual editor there.
Yeah, so I don't know how much folks have worked between the visual and the source editor here, but I've been working most of this in the visual editor, which is, it has this kind of like pretty interactive, but if you notice the way your table abundances, when I put this in, it just formatted it just directly as text, whereas the fig abundances, it understood to be special and formatted it as some code. It's easier to see what's going on if we go back to the source editor, which is going to look a lot more like the canonical, maybe I'm just showing my age, but the like canonical RMarkdown editor where we have the raw source code and we're not seeing that pretty auto formatting. And here in the source editor, it's put this little escape hash or escape backslash
Yeah.
in front of the table abundances, which is like saying, don't treat this as special code. And you'll have this happen. It can be kind of annoying, to be honest. It happens a lot with the source editor if it thinks it understands what you're trying to do. You're trying to write code in the source or in the visual editor. To get rid of it, get rid of that slash. And I believe then when we go back to the visual editor, it will have caught on that this is back to a reference. If you're having problems with things like refusing to render properly in Quarto, that's often the culprit. And you can diagnose it if you go over to the source editor and you see a whole bunch of those backward slashes around your markup.
They're also useful sometimes if you do want to literally print out an at symbol and not have to do something simple. Then you can use the backslash to do that. So
yeah, it's good to, yeah, sometimes it's a little overeager, but it is a very good functionality to have. One more function that I'd like to show, it can be a little bit, there are some steps to getting it up and running on your own computer, and that's probably a little bit outside the scope here, but it's a good feature to know about, is the functionality to track references to papers in a document like this. So I showed in the appendix, briefly, it had like references to papers and R packages. You can do that with similar syntax to this, like referring to the tables using Quarto. And so here I'm talking about including a bibliography and citing items from the bibliography in the text. And so,
can I
sorry?
share my screen again? Again, I have some problem with this table caption.
Yeah, I will give you the floor.
So I have written like this.
oh, interesting.
Could you, so when you render it and it just doesn't, it shows up as question mark caption, huh?
I wonder if it has to be a table.
Yeah, so
not
try
sure.
wrapping that 55, because I don't, yeah, it may be that our that Quarto isn't understanding this to be a table. So put that cable, K-A-B-L-E. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Knit R : cable. I put it in the chat. Put that around the head.
One more colon there. Cable.
And then cable, K-A-B-L-E. And then parentheses.
Yeah, so you're putting the head mouse rank data inside of the cable function.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, you probably want to get rid of that space between cable and the parentheses. Let's try that.
Those are square brackets. That's probably not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
So the cable is a function, and it's in the knit R package. So that colon is just a way of specifying like what package it's in without having to load it with library. So we're just doing the cable function around there. Yeah. So that should be around parentheses.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what that's doing is converting the data frame into a HTML table that works with this HTML output. And yeah, it looks like you can't make arbitrary outputs tables, that they have to actually be recognized as a table in order to be labeled as a table, which I didn't know. So
we have to, each time we have to like use this to show a table.
There's
multiple
options.
ways to show tables. Eric put some of them in the chat. I lean pretty, I like this one, but there's lots of options. And that's if you want it to be like linkable with the @ syntax. I believe that you can do an arbitrary figure specification. So you could do like, I haven't tested this a whole bunch of my own, but as I've been reading the documentation, you could specify a code chunk as outputting a figure. And even if it doesn't output an image, you can still tag it as you would a figure.
Okay, thanks.
And there's all kinds of other cross-references that I think we're not going to show, but you can do cross-references to equations, to like sections of the text, and possibly other things that I'm not remembering. So that's all a possibility.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So I guess picking up with probably a demonstration of including a bibliography and linking to that bibliography. There's some effort involved in generating a .bib file, but if you have a .bib file that has references in this, you can generate these using Zotero. And if you ever have trouble doing this generation, we're here for office hours. We're happy to work through it. You can pass that bibliography to Quarto in the YAML or the header of the document using this bibliography option. And the code in this script is already downloading a bibliography that I created for this so that we can show this. So we're going to use the bibliography portal ref.bib. And once we specify this in the header, we can refer to bibliographic entries that are in this .bib file in the text. And so for an example of that, I believe the only entry in this .bib file is for the data paper that these data come from. So let's go ahead and just say these data come from the portal project. And we can cite this reference with square brackets and an @ And then this bib file contains short names that link up to the references that it contains. And I will tell you that the short name for this reference is Ernest 2020. And let's render this and we'll see how it changes our document. So going over to the output file, first let's go up to where we put this text. So in the source document, it's listed as just at Ernest 2020. And here it's expanded it to the full reference and a link to the DOI. And if we click on this part of the formatted document, we come down to this automatically generated references section that will link up to everything that we've cited in this way throughout this document. And so this is something I find really powerful for generating like scientific reports in Quarto, because you can handle the reference tracking directly. You can generate those .bib files using any reference manager software as far as I'm aware of. I generate them using Zotero.
Quarto
yeah.
can also generate them for you.
Oh, that's interesting.
If it has a citation thing, which you might, if you go to back to the visual editor, and I think we're going to show this in more detail in an upcoming workshop. But if you go to insert citation, in that insert menu, there's a
yeah. So it's grayed out for now. Yeah, so the way I have historically done it is to use this .bib file, which is a little bit more, it's a little more analog, so you have to generate it and link up to it. But this will also be familiar if you've done this in RMarkdown, it's the same general approach. And yeah, I will say this is actually a really good time to plug that this is an example of the functionality that we're going to be hopefully offering a workshop on soon for Quarto manuscripts, which is a whole new like Quarto document type that is currently in beta and will be out soon. And Eric has been doing a lot of experimenting with and may make some of these functions, these operations even easier. Teaser for potentially upcoming programming from this group. Sticking with the focus today, I do want to also show some of the ways that we can share a document like this after we've generated it. So I'm going to hop back over to the slides to talk a little bit about this. Oh, sorry. So we've worked through going from an R document to a Quarto document. I'm cognizant of time and wanting to demonstrate converting an RMarkdown document over to a Quarto document as well. And I think that might be equally useful for folks. So I'm sorry, I clicked on the source document there. What we just worked through was generating a Quarto document from an R script from scratch. You can also do this using an RMarkdown document. Here's an example at this link. Again, you can download this file, or you could copy it all into a new RMarkdown document. I will show that. I'll copy Control A, and then we'll go back over to my R and show a quick conversion from RMarkdown to Quarto. So you can create a new file. And I'm going to create it completely empty because I have the file that I want. And I pasted the contents of what's online. And I'm going to save this as an RMarkdown document. And save it as a .rmd file. And so this document contains essentially the same code as we put in our Quarto document. It's written as an RMarkdown document. And it includes a little picture that I wanted to show. So for an RMarkdown user, we would knit this document. And it will go through a render process. And the output will show up over here in the viewer file as per usual. And so we could, to convert this to a Quarto document, an RMarkdown document will generally work as a Quarto document if we just rename it. So you could rename it in RStudio as a .qmd file. And maybe not. We open this, so we have to open it again, but we see it's converted from a knit to a render button. And generally you can just click render. And so you don't have to necessarily change all your options. To like change all your options to switch from the RMarkdown syntax to Quarto. And we can see here that the output has shifted from the RMarkdown document over to Quarto formatting. And we didn't actually have to change any of the source code to do that. If you would like to convert to Quarto more formally, so this is just executing code that we wrote as our Markdown code using the Quarto engine. But if you would like to change it to the Quarto syntax, or if you'd like to like update it to use additional Quarto features, there is a function that will take care a lot of that translation for you. And that function is knitr. It's in the knitr package, and the function is called convert chunk header. And we provide this function with the file name. So the file name for our Markdown document is mouse report as RMD. Oh, I've gotten rid of it. But we could rename this one back to it. Is mouse report as RMD.RMD. And we can provide it with an output argument for a new file name. So let's say mouse report to QMD.QMD. And this will generate us a Quarto document that contains our Markdown code, but reformatted or like for Quarto syntax. And I'll talk through some of the specific changes that it's made in a second, but for example, we've gone from specifying chunk options with like commas within the curly braces here to using that hashtag in the pipe lining here. And there are sometimes some changes that happen in the YAML. But so here we've used that knitr convert chunk header, and we've gotten ourselves a Quarto document that we can now render without having to get in the weeds of the code ourselves.
I can see this being really nice for long documents where it would be really tedious to switch everything over manually.
Yeah. So we can just take a quick look at this when it completes. So here's the RMarkdown version that we've just translated over. It looks very similar. And then if we wanted to add more of those features back in, like the figure captioning and stuff, we could do that in this document manually. But this will take care of the bulk of that kind of repetitive transferring. And have a little reference to those changes at a high level. Again, I think a major takeaway for the conversion from RMarkdown to Quarto is that a lot of .rmd documents will render perfectly happily as they are. If you want to make changes, some things to be aware of are that document level options, most of those are moved into the header. So for example, if you want to set the default for a code chunk to be that it doesn't echo, if you ever use the echo function, or the echo option, it tells whether or not code gets printed out as part of your document or it stays hidden. That's something you can specify in the header in Quarto. In RMarkdown, you have the option to specify different output formats. In the header, you still have that option in Quarto, but the name of that section is changed to format. And at the chunk level, it's a switch from that curly braces syntax that we've talked about to the hashtag pipe within the chunk that we've been showing. And for a helpful utility function, as a reference, is that convert chunk header function. And there are some more FAQs from Posit, who are the makers of Quarto, about high-level transitions from Quarto to RMarkdown at this link. And so my general steps for converting an RMarkdown document to a Quarto document, if that's needed, are to first use that convert chunk header function and then go back through and backfill any Quarto features that you want to add. Okay. So I'm cognizant that we want to have some time for you all to work on scripts of your own. So I'll talk through this section. I won't try to work through too much demonstration here. But we have a lot of options for sharing and distributing Quarto reports. A lot of this is similar to the options that you have with our Markdown documents. And the way I look at them is that they break down basically into those that are sort of like hosting the rendered document online with a URL that you could link to, versus documents that you might share, like passing around as email attachments or sharing with collaborators on GitHub. And so if you just want to link people to like the polished output, you could publish it to one of these platforms like Quarto Pub, which is very similar to our pubs if you're used to those for our Markdown. Publishing on Posit Connect, UA has a license for researchers, or pushing this to a GitHub repository using a GitHub specialized flavor of Markdown. Or you can generate those static documents like the rendered HTML documents, or you can render documents to PDFs or Word documents. Or you can share the actual source.qmd file, which can be good for collaboration if multiple people are contributing to the same document. So Quarto Pub is quite similar to our pubs. It's a website where you can host documents. It's where these slides are hosted. You can create accounts for free. The reports that you publish are going to be visible publicly, so have that in mind. And an example of something living on Quarto Pub I'll show, it's that appendix from before, but this has a link to a quarto.pub URL, and it has a readable slug, and it's the rendered output of a Quarto document that just lives on the internet. So I can link someone to that document. They don't need to log in or anything. Posit Connect previously was RStudio server, I believe. RStudio Connect, meh. Arizona UA has a license for viz.datascience.arizona. The license that U of A has is for university research. You probably don't have an account by default, but you can ask to have one created. It's really for sharing research documents and research outputs. It does have the option to specify private reports as well as published. And an example here is that same document living at a viz.datascience.arizona.edu URL. And this is the output that the option that honestly I used throughout graduate school, is to render documents using this GFM, which stands for GitHub flavored Markdown output, and then push or host that report somewhere on GitHub. And if you have a private GitHub repo, you can keep that document private, and the output will display on GitHub formatted. And so this is an example of that same appendix as a GitHub flavored Markdown document that's just living on my GitHub. And so for sharing with collaborators without having to go through a licensed Posit Connect server or going through Quarto Pub, you can share these GitHub flavored Markdown documents. There is some Quarto functionality that won't necessarily work in this format, but it is really powerful and can be really nice. For sharing rendered documents, you have a lot of options in terms of the format that you export your Quarto documents to. You can render them to HTML, which is the default, or common examples are going to be .docx or PDF. And those documents are going to be portable, and you can share them as email or as uploads. Both of the PDF or the docx formats are going to require that you have the right programs. So rendering to PDF, you'll have to install some version of TinyTech, which if you try to render to PDF, you'll get prompted to install. And if you render to docx, you'll need to have Word to look at them. But here is an example of that appendix rendered to a PDF document and uploaded to GitHub. And for anyone who's ever used LaTeX, PDF documents have a lot of that familiar formatting. But this is a PDF document, or if you want, you can go to this URL to download the Word document version. Which won't display on GitHub on its own, but if you were to click on this View Raw link, it'll download a Word document to your computer. I can show what that looks like, again, with very minimal effort. You can generate a formatted Word document. It's taking a second to open. And so any of those documents can be emailed around, or it can be used as essentially uploads for a journal. So this is an example of a Quarto Word document. We have the code and tables and figures as one might expect for an appendix. Lastly, you can always share the source code itself. So you can share the .qmd document with somebody, and then they can download it to their computer and render it, just like we've been doing here. I especially like this option if you're working with collaborators on GitHub, because you can track the changes that each of you has made to a document, and similar to the way you would track changes to an R script, you can handle those kinds of version control using GitHub instead of having to rely on Microsoft Word's track changes. And so an example of a document as it lives on GitHub is you can link to these .qmd documents. It'll have line tracking. It'll pay attention to changes. It'll keep the Git history if you do that via GitHub. Great. So that was kind of a lot of content because I did want to get us to the second section here where we have a bit of a break and then an opportunity to work through our scripts that you all may be working with, or to ask questions about how all of this works. So given that we're at 12:24, I might suggest, how are folks feeling? We could either take a 5-minute break and come back to working with your own code examples, or I have an example that we can continue to play with if you'd like, or we could keep going and just have time for questions and jump right into your own code.
I have a question for the bibliography, the citations.
Mhm.
So, I mean, how do we get these .bib files? So can we like download it from like online like websites or from their publication page?
So the way I generate them is using Zotero. More generally, there's going to be Quarto, the Quarto guide is going to have some information about
It's citations and footnotes there.
Yeah.
Authoring.
citations and footnotes, bibliography files. And it's going to give you some more sets of instructions for like different ways of generating citations. I can show you how I do it using Zotero, which is my reference management software.
Why don't I, if it's all right,
Mhm.
I could share my screen real quick and show the Zotero integration with
Sure.
Quarto.
Yeah, if you'd like to do that.
I don't know why it wasn't. Yeah. So there's a couple of ways to add citations without having to have made a bib file ahead of time. So this doesn't have a bib file associated with it. If I have a DOI, for example, which let me just open something up so I can get a DOI real quick. So that's one way to do it, is if you just have the DOI for a paper. And I'll just grab something here. Okay. Copied and pasted the DOI. So if I just start typing @ you see here it says or DOI. I can paste the DOI in there. That appeared to not quite work. Well, maybe it did. So yeah, there we go. And I think if I just hit render, it'll create that .bib file for me. That's maybe one way to do it. But the way that I like to do citations, let's see, did it work? No, that didn't really work. So the better way to do it, I think, is you can either go to this insert citation menu, or there's also, if you hit command / you get this like insert anything menu, and you can search for citation. This brings up a window, and this is where you could, for example, put in a DOI, and then we can say insert, and you see here it's created that references.bib for me. And so I don't have to worry about having to create that. I can also do, if you have Zotero as your reference manager, it just like integrates with it like automatically, or it should, and you should be able to search through your ASMET or your Zotero library and choose papers from that, and click insert, and they'll just be added to that references.bib automatically for you.
So from the DOI, so insert citation and @DOI option, we can directly take the reference from the web internet, right? So
Yeah.
we don't have to like individually save them or make these .bib files for those.
Yeah, so this is the .bib file that it created. So it created this, this was the one I pasted in the DOI, it pulled the metadata down, and then this was the one that I created from my Zotero. That's how I do it. You can also create this .bib file from any reference manager. You can export it, and then you can reference it using just using the @ symbol and the citation key. That works too.
So one more question is, so the example that Renata showed, so it's so when we write @ and the first letter E capital, so it doesn't show up as citation. But if we just write small case everything, then only it shows up.
I'm not sure I followed that.
I can show you
The
my
citation
screen.
keys can be case sensitive. Is that what you're?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if you were to capitalize the H in hey, Eric, I think it would complain.
Oh yeah, not work. Probably not.
Yeah.
My guess is it
I
wouldn't
feel
work.
like yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I couldn't find it. It gave you
Yeah,
a
it doesn't find it
question
there.
mark.
So yeah, they're case sensitive, and they're usually
Mhm.
always. I think they're. Well, actually, it depends. Yeah. So these ones are all lowercase, but yeah, it is.
Yeah, you can specify different ways to set those if you want, but
Okay,
yeah.
thank
So if you, oh yeah, go on. Oh, okay. Yeah, so if you're familiar with generating those .bib files, you can use whatever workflow you're used to, or you can use some of the newer point and click options. Question for the room. How many folks have an R script that you would like to render into Quarto as part of this workshop? It's fine if you don't. We have lots of things to play with. I think we have one. Oh, two. Three. Awesome. So
I
a
mean, we
few
can
folks.
go into like breakout rooms too, and people want to work on it and stuff like that. Or I don't know what you had planned, but I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, I think it would be great. I think it depends always a little bit on what folks have. So my suggestion is for those of if you have a script that you want to convert over, you can go into one breakout room and sort of do a little bit of co-working and then like supportive troubleshooting for about 15 or 20 minutes. And if you don't have a script that you want to work with, I have a little toy example that I can share with you and we can work through that together. Does that sound? Awesome. So I'm gonna create a breakout room, and Eric, do you want to go with folks who want to work on their own script?
Sure, yeah, I'll hang out.
Awesome, thanks. So if you want to work on your own script, go to room 1. And if you want to work on a script that I have, let's go to room 2. And let's regroup at 12:50 just to get linked up to more resources and answer any common questions. So I'm going to head over to room 2 to work on a toy script with anyone who wants to join. There we go. I'm unmuted. Hey. All right. So I'm going to share in the chat a link to an R script that will do similar to that mouse report script that we had. It'll download some data and generate some plots. And then it has a few little challenges in the comments for things to add for Quarto specific formatting. And I will go ahead and share my screen and, or I don't know, let's see. Would it be, how do you guys all feel about a level of comfort here? Do you want to work through it on your own and I'm here to help out, or do you want me to work it through as an example again? Example again? Yeah, sorry, it's been a lot of information, so that sounds like it would probably make some sense. Okay, so I'll share my screen in R, and I may be a little bit slower this time to say exactly what I'm gonna do. So I'm gonna create a new R session, so it's relatively empty. And I'll start by getting my R script. Oh, need to get the actual code from that R script into R. And so what this R script is going to do is we're going to use this package called Palmer Penguins, which is a kind of cute, fun data package. And if you don't have those packages installed, you're going to need to run these lines of code. If you do have them installed, don't bother reinstalling them. But then we'll load the penguins data. This is data on like abundances of 3 different species of penguins, and I guess islands in Antarctica. I don't know very much about penguins, but it's a great teaching data set. And it'll give us a data frame called penguins. And if you look at the penguins data frame, it's data on these different species of penguins and which islands they're on, and then measurements about the penguins, like the dimensions of their bills and how long their flippers are and how much they weigh. And so this script takes those data and then calculates like the average traits of these penguins on each island. So we can look at this data frame, and it's going to calculate like the average bill length for each species on each island and the average mass and different attributes. And then it'll make a plot of these different attributes. And I'll just show these plots for a second just so you get a look at one of them. This is going to be a plot of the bill length of the different species of penguin on each island. So we have different species and different colors and different islands and different panels, and it's just a density plot of what shape their bills are. So I'm not a penguin biologist, but it's a plot about penguins. So we can save this script as our initial R script. So I'll call it like penguins.r. And then get into the Quartoification of it. So create a Quarto document. Can go up to File, New File, Quarto document. We can give it a title here and say the author and create. And when we create a new Quarto document, we're going to have all of this boilerplate, which you can delete. And let's go ahead and come down here and we can insert an executable cell of our code. And this is going to give us a place to put our code. And we can start transferring the code over from the R script. So I am going to, we can copy the whole thing over to start. And paste it into this cell. And this is going to be like the minimum viable Quarto document. So we could save this as penguins.qmd. And we can render this. You all doing at this? Well, mine renders. Have you gotten to a Quarto document that has the penguins code in it? Getting some thumbs up. Yeah. All right. And what do you think of this output? Do your documents render? Yeah. So depending on the options you have in your your RStudio, you may find that it opens in its own separate browser window, which can actually be kind of nice. If you want to change that, you can change it in Tools, Global Options. Then under RMarkdown, you can tell it to show the output preview, and I'm pretty sure that'll also change where your Quarto outputs show. I'm gonna leave mine the way they are. So this version of it is pretty pretty bare bones. We have no annotation, no text. And what I like to do after having done something like this is to break it up into more chunks. So for example, we can break out of our load packages, and here let's see what happens if we use the 3 tick marks. See, that doesn't work in the visual editor. But if we go over to the source editor, we have more control over breaking out chunks. And so we can create 2 chunks out of 1 chunk if we do the 3 backticks, and then create a new set of 3 backticks to specify a new chunk. And we can toggle back over to the visual editor and see how that's split. What we had is 1 massive chunk into multiple smaller chunks. And so I would then go through and break out these 3 different sections from the setup, data calculate different sections of this script. And we can add some text around these that describes what we're doing in each one. So for example, we could say, setting up the document. We're setting up the data, let's say. A chunk for looking at the data. And we can break these. Again, using those 3 hash marks will end a chunk, and then we can create a new one with the 3 hash marks and the curly braces, very similar to RMarkdown. And we could label this calculating trait measures. I'm just following off of the comments that I put in the script and breaking it another one into plotting the traits. So having broken something apart like this, I would, a couple of things to point out. One is that you start to have more, if you toggle this outline view in the editor, you get more information about the structure of the document. And then when you render the document up here, you start to get more, more text showing up interwoven with the code. So here we've started to get calculations of the getting headings, noting what we're doing on each section. You could add more text here to get more descriptive. And we can also start playing with some of the chunk options to get some of this to display a little bit more nicely. We've touched on a few of these. We can not show code if we don't want it to print out. And that would be using the hash pipe. We can say echo and set it to false. And that will hide this code from what gets shown in the document. We can also go back to that figure specification. It can be, there's some pretty advanced functionality in Quarto for dealing with like multiple panel figures, which if you're interested in, I'll link you to the documents later. For now, I'm gonna show it with just one chunk for the figure. So we'll demo this with one figure. We can use those same hash pipes and say label, call it fig bill length, and we can give it a caption with like fig cap bill length. And so we can take a look at this. And so examples of how that's translated by setting that echo to false. We've gotten rid of the like library code, although it's still showing us some output. And if we go down to the figure plots, we've gotten ourselves a caption for the bill length plot. How's it going? Are there questions or things that you'd like to talk more about before we go back to the main room?
Are there any commands that can prettify the tables too, like the same way we do that in Markdown?
Mm-hmm. So like, do you mean like data tables, like data frames, or like a table that you want to show like not data?
Well, I think I meant the data frame, like
Mhm.
you can have a head of the data frame, but presented in a nice way instead of like a raw data.
Yeah, so there's like several different ways to do that. I don't know if you, and that like similar, if you use them in RMarkdown, like GT table, I like knitr cable, so you could do that by wrapping. So for example, here we're looking at the head of the penguins data frame. We could put that head line inside the cable function, which is in the knitr package. So that's going to look like knitr : cable to say we want the cable function from knitr, and then put the data frame in there. And when we render this, it'll render it nicely formatted. But I don't know if do you use one of these in RMarkdown already?
Yeah, I think so. But I remember I used lemon package to prettify the tables. Yeah, I don't quite remember it, but that's how it was called. That was a weird name. Yeah.
It will probably work. I don't know that one, but my guess is that it will work in Quarto as well, because the Quarto folks have been really good about preserving our Markdown compatibility. But here's an example in the formatted document of how cable looks. It's not that sort of, console looking output. It's prettified.
I'm looking at this lemon R package, and it prettifies ggplots, but it also has something called lemon print that will, make the formatting of tables and things look a little nicer. I have not heard of this one either, so it's cool. I like the name.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Yeah. I'll have to check it out.
And it's based on knitr, so it probably works fine, like in the same way that this does. So
yeah. Anything else before we head back? Okay. I'm gonna then bring us all back to the main room. All right. Well, I think we're all back. Awesome. How did that go? Or how was the DIY room? We had some fun with penguins.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we chatted about sort of Eldritch was asking about using Quarto to create a README. So we're talking a little bit about GitHub flavored Markdown and one tip was you can include HTML comments as a reminder to yourself to edit the source document and not the rendered document. So.
Oh yeah, that can be can tie yourself in knots.
Yeah, and then Jessica was working on it sounded like a nice sort of wrap up kind of project to hand some data over to collaborators. So yeah.
Yeah, so
Fantastic.
I feel like
No, go ahead.
I feel like I just barely got started with pulling all the code in there and trying to sort through errors that I'm getting now.
Oh no. Yeah, it's kind of Quarto can, I don't know, I find it can be very revealing because it'll tell you if something's not standalone, but it can also be really finicky, or like RMarkdown too, I'm sure, like can be really finicky about file paths and stuff. So depending on what you're dealing with, it can be fast or not fast. Yeah. Well, before we go, I did want to, because this is like so little time and there's so much to do in Quarto, I just wanted to make sure that we send you off with some links to more resources for being successful as you do things in Quarto. So a good starting point is going to be the Quarto documentation, which we've shown a couple of times, but here's a link dump for the Quarto website itself. The Quarto docs guide, which is beautiful and really helpful and searchable. And probably going to stay more up to date than anything else out there. There's a Quarto cheat sheet for the similar sort of spirit as like the dplyr cheat sheets and stuff that are out there for quick reference. And there's also support that we offer. So we're available for drop-in hours from Tuesdays 9 to 10. We'd love to see you there. We're also happy to do things, including Quarto flavored things as parts of incubator projects. And we're planning to offer more workshops, some of them potentially Quarto themed in the future, especially if there's interest in that. So we're going to be sending around a survey if you have the chance to take it that will include an option to note if you're interested in more advanced Quarto workshops. For example, a Quarto manuscripts workshop, because we're excited about that as an upcoming feature. There's also a lot more data science resources at UA than just our group. There's ResBaz, and with that there's Coffee and Code, Hacky Hour, and there's a UA data science Slack channel that will include updates for both for Coffee and Code and style events. And you can sign up at this link. I'll throw it in the chat. And everything is also linked to from this slide deck, which we can send around after the workshop as well. And there's drop-ins offered by the libraries, and the Data Science Institute is here as well. Lastly, there's online resources for Quarto. There's a lot of excellent blogs. I don't have like a single blog that's great, but if you search for something in Quarto, often people have worked through examples in their own blog. Stack Overflow is a good resource for the familiar. And there's a RStudio community message board that can be good for RStudio specific questions. With that, thank you all for coming and sticking around through the hour. For more information about things we're up to, including upcoming website workshops and linking up to our drop-in hours, you can go to our website. We'll also send out all of these links and a quick follow-up survey after the workshop. Otherwise, I'm around to chat more if you have any lingering questions, or we can let you go about your day. And thank you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Go ahead and stop the recording.